heard this morning, I want to, everybody's had a wonderful Thanksgiving, I hope. Right? I mean, you're with friends and family members, and did anybody eat a little too much? Yeah, anybody, I put on my pants this morning, and I'm like, uh-oh, this is going to be a problem, so I am going to go on that diet, that diet that I'm going to go on, and it's soon, but maybe I'll save it for a New Year's resolution. We got some more celebrating coming up, don't we, this next month? We're going to have Christmas and the hams and the food and all the wonderful time we have together. We celebrated this Thanksgiving at the greenhouse on the campus of North Point, with 3 families came together, and we all just had a potluck celebration, and it was so much fun sitting around the table and listening to the stories that people told. I mean, you heard some wonderful stories, learned some things about some people over Thanksgiving meal that you didn't know before, and just the celebration. We had a wonderful Thanksgiving meal with the leadership team from Hope Church at our home a couple of weeks ago, and I think I probably laughed more on that day than I have in years. We had so much fun just connecting over our common experiences. It's just a time of joyful fellowship when we gather together and sit down at a table and enjoy each other's presence. And then, of course, the food. Oh, my goodness. I remember as a college student, you'd be eating that mystery meat in the college cafeteria. It is covered in gravy. And we're like, what is it? He's poking it, and let him eat it. Let's see if he does okay. Let Mikey eat it first. Let's see if he likes it. Before we decided. And then I would drive 16 hours on a Wednesday. We had morning classes, so Thanksgiving was the next day, and I would drive 16 hours all night to get home, just so I could wake up in my own house after a couple hour nap, so I could have that wonderful Thanksgiving meal that my mom was going to prepare. I mean, that food, it just is so invigorating and life-giving. It's a wonderful thing when we celebrate together around a table. And so what I wanted to preach on this morning is food. Fellowship. Meals, right? Now, what's interesting, because in the Bible, the kingdom of God is oftentimes compared to a number of different analogies, but one of the most common metaphors or pictures that we get of the kingdom is a banquet. So in Matthew chapter 22, Jesus is telling this parable about this great banquet. In this case, it's going to be a celebration of the king's son is going to get married. So it's going to be a wedding celebration. And the parable that he talks about with this wedding celebration is one that we will all be invited to. Because it hasn't happened yet. Even though he's talking about it in Matthew 22, it hasn't happened yet. It's what's going to happen in the last days when we have in Revelation what is described as the wedding supper of the Lamb. Jesus is the Lamb. He's the Son of the King. It's his marrying the church, and we will all be a part of that as believers in eternity. The future of the kingdom, the future experience all of us will have is eating a meal together that God has prepared for us. Now, I'm really good at fellowshipping, and I'm especially good at eating. But my wife tells me there's another part to these Thanksgiving meals and these Christmas meals, right? It's called preparation, right? Now, when we had everyone come over to our house a couple weeks ago for our early Thanksgiving dinner, Laura Lee, she had to organize that meal. She had to go to the store. For days in advance, she was planning, and the day before, she pretty much just had, she was in the kitchen. Almost all day long, cooking and cooking and cooking to get ready for that wonderful time we were going to have, the wonderful food we were going to eat, and the wonderful fellowship we were going to have. And God is preparing a meal for all of us. Thinking of a few thousand years, imagine what a good meal that's going to be all the time. And he's pretty good at what he does. Laura Lee's very good at what she does. God is a bit better, though. And he's getting things ready for us for this huge celebration. And Jesus is saying, that's what the kingdom is like in Matthew chapter 22. He says in verse 2, the kingdom of heaven is like a king who was preparing a wedding banquet for his son. He sent his servants to those who had been invited to the banquet to tell them to come. It's like, this is the moment. The food has been prepared, right? Now, there's a big moment when someone is fixing a meal, it's Thanksgiving meal or some other big meal that someone has fixed, and when that dinner bell rings, we don't really use those anymore, but as an expression, when the call comes, dinner's ready, you're not supposed to delay. You're supposed to come right away. Right? I've delayed sometimes, and the boy, what are you, it's going to get cold. We're going to eat without you if you're not going to come down here. I'm trying to save my computer game I'm playing, trying to wrap it up before I run down there to eat that meal. But when it's time to come, the person who's been preparing this meal all along expects you to show up and not delay, because they have been preparing this meal. And the cost of time for us is significant, but what it's going to cost the king to prepare this meal is ultimately his son's life. He wants people to show up. So, there's a problem at the end of verse number 3 in this little parable. After he says, tell them to come, he sent out the messengers. He sent out the text. They used human servants back then. But he sent out the text. He made the phone calls. He announced, the time is now to come. But that sentence, that verse ends in verse 3, they refused to come. Empty seats. All this time? All this preparation? Where are they? Then he sent some more servants. I'll send a second text out. I'm gonna call some more people, find out why aren't they here? What's going on? Tell those who have been invited, I have prepared my dinner. This is God speaking in this parable. My oxen and fattened cow have been butchered, and everything is ready. Come to the wedding banquets. But they paid no attention and went off, one to his field. Well, that was really important. Another to his business. Some of them even seized the servants and mistreated them. And the king ended up being angry at this lack of response. I don't know if you ever had that where you fixed a big meal, a bunch of people said they're going to come, and you spent all this time and money and effort to put that together, and then you find out last minute everybody's opting out. Mm-hmm. All of a sudden, you had rearranged the furniture in your home or the place where you were going to host this meal, and now you got to decide, you got to put those chairs away, and you got to put the tables, because you don't want to look like it's too empty. Because all of a sudden, these people who said they were coming, all of a sudden aren't coming, and now you're going to have all this extra food left over, and the king wants every seat filled at this banquet. Because it's supposed to be a time of wonderful fellowship and joy and life-giving experience at the king's table. And yet, they seem to think there's other things, field, a business, life, just more important. They're distracted. They're busy. They have stuff. Stop telling us about this. They tell his servants and even mistreat them at one point. So sometimes we get this banquet ready and we can find that there are some challenges to those meals. Not all the Thanksgiving meals are necessarily like the Norman Rockwell painting, right? Where it looks like everybody's happy and smiling and everything else. Sometimes at some of our meals, we get a little tension going, right? Someone doesn't necessarily feel like they belong, or someone else might be jealous of someone else, and someone may have hard feelings towards another person. And oftentimes these meals are intended to be wonderful times of fellowship and food and life-giving, can also have some underwritten storylines that are not always create tension for us. There's a story that is probably the most well-known story in the Bible, so it's like prodigal son. Who doesn't know that story, right? Luke chapter 15. And what we forget is that the whole point is the father's preparing a banquet. And he wants his boys there. We testify. We pray. Family members. And one of them he doesn't get it. He doesn't understand his father's love. And so he goes off and he's looking in a far country for whatever it is he thinks he's missing. And he's spending his father's hard-earned money and his time and his efforts. And the next thing you know, he's starving in a pig pen. And then finally the day comes when he opens his mind up to the idea that maybe my father's house wasn't really, maybe, when he went off looking, he found it in his father's arms when he returned and experienced the love and the grace and the forgiveness. You see, the father wants the seats filled at his banquet table. And evangelism is going out and sharing with people, it's time to come. But once they arrive, hospitality has to kick in. Hospitality is what happens when someone we have invited has shown up and they're wondering, do I really belong in this place? Right? So that the younger son is coming back and he's filled with dirt and he stinks and his shoes have worn out and he's a mess and it's not just a mess physically, he's dirty because everything he's done over those past few years, and he's wondering, if you really knew me, would you really, do I belong? And then people come in to this place and they'll wonder if they belong. And it's important for us. If we want to have fellowship, one of the things that makes a Thanksgiving meal really great is when someone really knows how to make people feel at home. Some people just have this incredible gift to do that. Like, you belong, and we're so glad you're here. And that person, you can tell sometimes someone's an introvert like me, they're a little awkward. They're like hanging back a little bit. And too big a crowd makes them nervous. Lorley's in the middle of it. I'm on the edge, watching it all happen. That's because that's my personality. But they just have a way of making everybody feel right. We're at a family. Just the time that we've had here and the sharing of the testimonies and hearing each other's stories, it felt like we're sitting around a table in a sense, having fellowship, didn't it? Because we learned things about other people we didn't know before. And we're celebrating what's going on in each other's lives. And we're sharing and praying for each other in their challenges that they might be facing, because that's what the kingdom is. See, the best way to celebrate the kingdom is to start doing now what we're going to do in eternity. If heaven is a banquet, if heaven is that kind of fellowship, if that's what happens in heaven, then why shouldn't it be happening on earth now in anticipation of what we will experience in the future? The best way to honor the kingdom is to begin to do it now, here, in our fellowship with each other. See, the older brother didn't get that part about the hospitality, right? He's still remembering, hey, he squandered our money, and hey, by the way, you know all the stuff he did, and he's whispering in his father's ear, and when it's all over with, the dad is sitting at the banquet. He's been fattening the calf the whole time because he's been preparing this meal for this moment, and now has arrived, and he looks, and there's an empty seat, and it's not the prodigal who's missing. It's the older brother who didn't know how to let go of stuff, and thinks it's all about hard work, and doesn't really want to. He spent his life working next to his father and hanging out with his father, but he never understood his father's heart. He looks like him, he imitates him by the way he works, but he never understood the heart of the father. And in that moment, that distance is set in because he doesn't understand hospitality. And the father's out in the field begging him because there's an empty seat, and God hates empty seats. Right? So it's like this image of this, the kingdom is oftentimes compared to is this banquet, this meal that we're going to have with each other. One of the really, I'm going to skip that part of it. Okay, so we'll shorten this sermon up for you, right there. Save a little few minutes, right? So Jesus is getting ready to go to the cross. And he's going to go to the cross. He's got one last night he can spend with his disciples. And think of the different things he could have done in that final night with his disciples. Well, they do some praying, and that's not so successful because they're not really prayer warriors. Okay, yeah. But all the things he could have done, what does he do? What does he plan for? What does he prepare for? Is a meal. We call it the Last Supper. It's Passover. It's a reminder of the Israelites when they originally were delivered out of Egypt in slavery, all those hundreds of years earlier. So Jesus is actually setting it up, and he said, when you go, we go find the person, they'll have a donkey, and then they'll take you somewhere. He's actually making arrangements as the host. So what is he doing the last big moment with his disciples is he's hosting a meal. He wants to sit at a table and fellowship with his disciples. The part I just cut out, I'll mention it real quick, and I won't go into the details, but one of the things that happens when you sit down at a meal is everybody's equal. Nobody's better than anyone else. You're all eating out of the same bowl. Even Judas is dipping his hand in the same bowl as Jesus at the Last Supper. Everybody's sharing together, right? Everyone is. And what happens sometimes is like the disciples at that Last Supper going into it, they're fighting over who's going to have the best seat in the coming kingdom. Like, whoa, you don't get it. Like Jesus criticized the Pharisees because they had their best seats at the banquet, and you're worried about having the honored seat. It destroys the idea of equality. And what mutual submission does when you understand equality is it brings about unity, and that's so much a characteristic of the kingdom. Unity through mutual submission, joyful fellowship. All these things are so important. It's life-giving event when we come into the kingdom. So Jesus is going to prepare a meal for his disciples. They're going to sit down and they're going to fellowship with one another. And when none of them want to get up and wash the dirty feet, who wants to humiliate it? That's my bro. I'm not going to wash his feet. Like, I have an older brother. There is no way I'm washing his. I'll wash everybody else's feet, not his feet. Because he punched me once. No, anyway, there's all that going on, in the back of these people's mind. Jesus is the one, of course, who shows you what unity, what submission, what servanthood, what love, what the kingdom really is about in that moment. And then John gives us this really long description of the conversation that happens. And the back and forth and the questions, and going somewhere you can't go. And Tom's like, well, why can't we go with you? And they're just asking questions, and it's like chapters of just Jesus talking, sitting at a table, fellowshipping with the ones who are going to carry on the mission. Everything he's invested his life in for the last 3 years. And when he does this, and in a moment we're going to remember this by celebrating the Lord's Supper together. But what we sometimes miss when we read the words that Jesus speaks about the cup and the bread is we sometimes miss how it ends. That passage in Matthew chapter 26, after he's talked about the cup and the bread, he says this in verse 29. Right? It's a little section about what Jesus is saying as he's there with his disciples at that last meal. He says in verse 29, I tell you, I will not drink this fruit of the vine from now on until that day when I drink it new with you in my Father's kingdom. And we're all going to be together. Next time, it's going to be, let's describe it in Revelation. Next time, we're going to be together in this incredible celebration that's coming. And so what Jesus is doing is, he is anticipating the future and knowing that's what the kingdom is. He wants to experience it as a foretaste in the present, in that moment, his last few moments with his disciples. And of course, he explains why it is that they can be present. Why is they're invited? Why is everyone's invited? It's because he's going to make a new covenant. They're going to do things to me tomorrow. You don't understand. It'll bewilder you at first. You'll be stunned. They're going to Because the invitation is so important. I'll lay down my life so you can be there with me. It's the next time I hold this cup, the next time I take this bread in my hands, I want you there. But you got to say yes to the invitation. The invitation we read about in Matthew 22, the first passage. Great banquet the king sends out. Don't get busy with other things. Don't get distracted by life. It's for us to say yes to this incredible invitation to come so that we can sit at the table with him and be a part. And experience for a moment right now is Jesus is present with us as we honor him, as we remember him, a foretaste of the great banquet that is to come. In Matthew chapter 26, I think the way we're going to celebrate the Lord's Supper is I'm just going to invite one section to come up at a time and can serve ourselves here in the front. Okay? So maybe we should go ahead